Welcome to another VC Wisdom Pod. We have Dan Rasmussen with us today. Dan is a partner at Verdad Advisors. He's also the author of a cool book called The Humble Investor: How to Find a Winning Edge in a Surprising World. So, Dan, I'm really glad to have you on today. Tell us a bit more about yourself and what you're up to nowadays.
Thanks, Charles. Nice of you to have me on. As you said, I just came out with my book, The Humble Investor, which I'm really excited about. And the central idea is that we can't predict the future. That humans have many gifts, but prophecy is not among them. So if we start from the viewpoint that we can't predict anything, what would you do as an investor? How would you respond? I call this future nihilism, right? The idea that we can't predict anything about the future. And how would that change your investing behavior? If your DCF model, for example, was completely worthless, right? That your out-year predictions meant absolutely nothing. And what I do in the book, in The Humble Investor, is to say, let's start from that premise of future nihilism. And we know that's not totally true. There's some things we can predict about the future. You can look at a weather forecast, right? The future isn't totally unpredictable, but it's much more unpredictable than we think. The world is much more surprising than we think. And so it's betting against hubris and finding a humble way to work through the world that I think is the right path to finding success in markets.
And why do you think it is so hard to predict this world? Is it chaos? Is it entropy, thermodynamics, quantum physics? And don't you think that humans should still work on that prediction muscles? Because I feel that a bunch of humans nowadays don't want to predict anything, and they become intellectually lazy in doing so, and their brain starts to atrophy at that moment.
I think that there's a difference between planning and predicting, right? We can plan for the future. We can set goals, what we'd like to achieve. We can develop a strategy for how to get there. But where we err is making in financial markets and making specific predictions about things that are inherently unpredictable, right? Like what the price of oil is going to be, or what the revenues for some company are going to be, or what events might unfold, and what GDP or inflation might be. These things are inherently unpredictable. And what makes it even more interesting, right, is that the market is a giant betting machine. And so when you're trying to make a market forecast, you're not just expressing your own view, but you're playing in a competitive market where everyone else is expressing their own view. There's a great case study of this in Japan, where every company is required to issue corporate guidance 1 year out. So every April they release guidance for the March of the next year, fiscal year. And if you divide the world into companies that are expecting slow growth, medium growth, or high growth, companies are accurate at sorting into those three categories about 50% of the time, right? So it's better than random chance. Random chance would be about 33%, right? Accuracy. They're 50%, right? So CEOs kind of know sometimes the direction that their companies are going. The problem is that if you then try to think about, well, why don't I just buy the fastest growing companies if they're roughly, we know with 50% accuracy that we're going to that they're actually going to grow fast. The problem is that if you look at the stock prices, in the 50% of time that a high growth company actually does grow fast, the stock does really well, right? It beats the market. It's a great win. But the other 50% of the time, when the stock doesn't grow fast, it actually dramatically underperforms the market because it was a big disappointment. On the other hand, in the 50% of times you predict slow growth and get slow growth, your stock underperforms the market by a little bit. Not a lot, because you told the market, after all, that you were going to grow slow. But the 50% of the time that you beat the market, actually the stock does really well. And so if you do the sort of sum product, the average of the returns and the probabilities, you end up finding no edge in the growth prediction. It just doesn't matter whether you grow fast, whether you're predicting to grow fast or grow slow, because the amount of error around those forecasts is enough to wipe out the entire edge. And I think there are so many predictive tasks like this, where we do our own analysis and we think we're right, but we're not right enough to make it worth actually acting upon that forecast.
Right. So, how did Ray Dalio do it? George Soros, Munger, Jim Simmons. What were their tricks? And were these guys just part of the 0.1%? And others should just not play that game if they're not going to be that obsessed about it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there are all different answers, right? I mean, I think there are different responses to the unpredictability of the future. The answer is that none of them had a crystal ball, right? None of them were able to sort of magically predict the future multiple years out, right? but they had different strategies that ended up, working quite well. I think nobody knows what Jim Simons' strategy was, but it had to do with very short-term arbitrages, clearly. And I think if there's one thing that I would observe is that about forecasting is that the further into the future you're trying to predict, the harder it is to do it. And I think one of the things that smart investors have in common actually is making relatively focusing on the short term, making bets about the short term. There are people like Buffett that made very long term bets, but I think making those long term bets and getting them right, obviously you earn tremendous rewards. But I think in sort of day to day trading, the path to winning often looks like being a little bit more accurate on short term forecasts. Rather than making these, big long-term bets, and nobody knows what's going to end up happening.
Right. Tell me about AI. AI seems to be quite good at predicting the future. LLMs are built on that. Are you using some of these to predict better nowadays?
I'm skeptical that of the use of AI for this type of predictive task, at least when it comes to markets. I think one of the defining things about markets is the level of noise. There's a huge amount of data, a huge amount of noise, and I think when you look at more complex forecasting models, in which I group LLMs, the problem is they tend to overfit to the past data. So if you're looking at things that are going to predict the future well, usually they're relatively simple. Uh, they're often have cause effect relationships. They're relatively simple. You can usually identify them with simple linear regressions. If something is not identifiable with a linear regression, and yet an LLM is finding it, in my view, the most common explanation for that is the LLM is overfitting, right? It's finding sort of relationships that existed in the past, but are they likely to persist in the future? Probably not. And so I think, again, one of the great tasks in markets is actually pruning back your analysis, right? There's so much we can't answer. You're better off saying, gee, um, my sphere of competence or my ability to know is very bounded. And so, given this tremendous uncertainty, what should I do, right? How should I act? How can I make good judgments? How can I first start to peel back, right? I should stop making forecasts when I know I have no accuracy, right? That's sort of step one. So, pruning back the level and amount of analysis we're doing to focus only on the things that we know we can do and we know we can achieve. And then, second, trying to plan for uncertainty, right? So, for example, you might say, well, gee, I know there will be a recession. I just don't know when it's going to come. So rather than betting on, like, I'm not going to go short the S&P 500 because I think that there's going to be a recession, but rather what I could do is develop a plan for what to do when a recession comes, right? So when a recession comes, here's the actions I'm going to take. One of those things is useful, which is planning, and the other, which is shorting the market on your forecast, is not useful, right? It's based on a fallacy about your forecasting ability.
Right. And your book, tell me why you started that the new venture and how's it done for you so far on Amazon?
Yeah, so I wrote the book. I write a weekly research email, which if you're interested, you can sign up at Verdad Cap on my Twitter or my X account. You can see it there. So I've been writing a weekly research email about markets for about since 2015 or so about 10 years every week. And I decided about 10 years in to write a book to take sort of what I'd learned and try to put it all together. And I think I've been delighted by the response. We've sold a lot of copies. It's been well received. A very nice review in the Wall Street Journal. And if you look at Amazon, the reviews there are very, very positive, which I'm thrilled about. And I think the goal of the book again is to grapple with uncertainty, unpredictability, and also to focus us on a few of the places where I think, if the positive is humility, right? We want to bet, we want to be humble in making our bets. The opposite of which is hubris, and I think we want to find the places where markets are most hubristic. And I think the place that is true the most today is in private markets and private equity and in private credit, where everybody has bought in that these things are the best things since sliced bread, including the people making their investments, and people have massively over allocated to a space that I think is really quite concerning. So I think in the book there's both an advocacy of a way of acting or an approach to the world that's embraces humility, embraces uncertainty, and also I think a quite vicious critique of those people and those strategies where I think the opposite is happening, where people are acting with too much hubris, too much overconfidence. And I think the biggest thing, Charles, in investing, right, is you're looking for, it's not just what people believe, but sort of what percent of people believe it, right? How correlated are our beliefs? And when you start to see in investing, 90, 80, 90% of people thinking that something's true, either it's a fact of life or it's a risky bubble. And in this case, private markets are a risky bubble.
Talking about that, most CEOs and founders that I talk to on this podcast on a daily basis do not believe that AIs are going to replace jobs. So I think that would be a very strong asymmetric bet for me to make in some shape and form, because I do believe it's going to slash out most jobs and replace them, right? Like not create new jobs even, but just have a market of pure AI agents. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, I think that you look at the different places, coding, for example. And in my firm, we do a lot of coding. There are people that spend, almost 100% of their time writing code. And they would say AI is a 3 to 5 times productivity increase. So you could argue that's three, 3 to 5 additional people we don't have to hire thanks to AI. Or you could say, well, gee, maybe that product, I haven't changed my employment. So perhaps it's just been a productivity enhancer. But I don't know. I think it's one of those things. I think it's very hard to predict. I mean, I think, Charles, to give you a contrary argument to yours, and I'm stealing this. I forget whose idea this was, but it's a clever one, which is self-driving cars, right? Think of Waymo, how much time and how much money they've invested in building a self-driving car. And then think about how much time and effort it takes to teach a 16-year-old how to drive. It's a lot easier to teach a 16-year-old how to drive. So I think it was Larry Summers who said that humans are the cheapest self-reproducing, reprogrammable robots available. And so I think, don't discount us, Charles. We're relatively cheap relative to AI still. AI still costs a lot of money to run these models, and we're very adaptable, and we self-reproduce, which is a great advantage of the human species.
I remember my 16-year-old self trying to drive a stick shift, and I wouldn't want that human to drive me around anytime.
Right.
I
So
think the
you'll go with
Waymos,
Waymo.
yeah, well, the Waymos, I think it's a learning curve, right? But once they reach the top, I mean, it's reproducible exponentially, and it's exponentially safer as well. That's been proven. So very hard to steelman that one then. But yeah, there's like interesting arguments to be made for it, but yeah, for me it's hard to justify that. It's just that right now people view AI as a chat, right? Like ChatGPT, but what most don't realize that we're hitting the AI agent age, the agentic age, and that means that these things are going to start having their own goals, right? And they're going to go out there by themselves without much indications, and then they can proliferate. They learn faster than us. They're faster than us. They're fully connected to a gigantic network. So it's just going to be very tricky, and I'm just curious to see if that one day happened, what would that do to the stock market, especially let's say if most humans become jobless or on UBI, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we can look back at the history of technological innovation, and the maddening thing about talking to quantitative investors or historians like me is that the answer is always a historical analog. When I think people want a transformative view of how the future could be different. But I think when we look at the history of technological innovation waves, and they do happen periodically, right? The railroad, they mentioned the railroad, they mentioned electricity, the steam engine, right? I think we're going through a period that's as momentous as that, right? We are living through an age that's like living through the development of classical music with Beethoven and Mozart, right? It's that significant to humanity, what's happening in technology. And you think about the internet, mobile, the cloud, AI, holy smokes, we've seen a huge leap in human progress. And I think what you find is I'd say there are a few observations, right? One thing is that there's always predictions that humans are going to be massively put out of work by technology, and it's never historically been true. It might be true this time, but it hasn't in the past. The second point is that initially the rewards from technological innovation go to the people that create the foundational technologies. However, what you see is something called competition neglect. Essentially, too many people invest in the foundational technology, right? That's overinvestment, and they overbuild capacity. Prices come down, and the return on investment is much lower than they anticipated, even though the technology is amazing. And the people that then benefit subsequently are actually the customers, who end up getting this new technology quite cheaply, and and for whom it turns out to be massively productivity enhancing. So I think my bet, when you think about what's going to be the implication of AI in the stock market, right? We've seen a classic first wave where Nvidia and others have benefited from this massive technological wave. But my bet is that actually the in the long run, the ones that'll benefit, right? Think of a large company that has 400 people doing some manual task. Maybe AI could automate that quite cheaply, and all of a sudden their margins jump. And to your point, they'll have to find new work. And the question that I think you're asking is, will they be able to, or is there just a threshold above which humans are just outcompeted by AI?
And what part of your framework is based on history, and does older data means like less relevant, right? Because yeah, we went from hunting with spears to having a genius in a bottle in her hand that can answer pretty much any question and can superate your brain, and that was hard to fathom just like 6 years ago.
Yeah, I think the Mesolithic period was probably the least relevant in our financial analysis. So, we with a hunter-gatherer period, we rarely take the financial data from that to try to garner any market insights. Although I would be impressed if I could come up with a good model along those lines. But I think you're right, right? I mean, the more recent data is more relevant. And however, you can think about relevance as a statistical concept. You can think about a vector of signals and how other vectors relate to that. And I think one of the things you also consider is that sometimes something that feels unique happens, right? So let's say the stock market went down 50%. Um, Data from right now would not be all that helpful, right? We're not living through a period of crisis, right? The data that would be very relevant to that data would be March of 2020 or the middle of 2008 or some other period when the stock market had crashed, right? So I think there are a number of variables to balance, but the relevance of your historical analogs matter, right? So you want to look at the historical analogs, rate them by relevance, and then apply them. But there will be limitations, Charles, right? These are not even using historical base rates and using historical data. One of the things is you're always kind of perpetually short innovation, right? You're never going to capture technological change particularly well because you're using historical data. And so if something is changing, a paradigm is shifting, it's problematic. And so I think that you have to look at it in the context of a variety of other imperfect methods. Just sort of imagining the future or reading popular science isn't going to get you there either.
And what about rate value with the equilibriums of power? For example, is it more simplistic and easier to predict that the US is going to fall, for example? Can it be done on very old predictions? He looked at the balance of the world a couple of centuries ago. How did he come up to that prediction? And do you actually agree with it? Which is, that one is, I feel, is quite controversial.
Yeah, I think the reliability of a prediction of the future is easily measured by, how frequently has how much data do we have? How many examples of this do we have, right? If you drop an apple from a tree, you can drop the apple from a tree several thousand times, and everything, the same thing's going to happen each time. We can be pretty confident we drop an apple from a tree. Next time, it's going to fall too. So there are, clear cause and effect relationships where you don't need any sort of complex forecasting. If, on the other hand, you're trying to forecast a once every 100 years event, well, we don't have particularly many samples, right? We just don't really know. A once every year event is a lot easier to predict than a once every 20-year event, right? We have more data, more periods where we can test our predictive accuracy. So I think making sort of these broad, grand proclamations is fun and interesting, but as a predictive task is not a useful exercise.
Right, and also cleaning that data, right? Because the history books are written by the ones that won it, so it's not always clean data that we have to predict the
Right, and
future
and I think
outcomes.
we have to remember that there are many alternative histories that were foreclosed by chance, right? I mean, a bullet that moved 1 inch or another makes a big difference in history. The wind blows one way, and We don't know what would have happened in that alternative history. It's been foreclosed. And I think now what's sort of interesting, we can imagine many alternative futures. And neither you nor I, right? You can say AI is going to cost millions of jobs. And I can say, I don't know, it'll cost some jobs, but they'll find other uses, right? You and I could argue all day long, but until 5 years from now, maybe we'll know the answer. But both of us could marshal evidence, but neither you nor I could prove each other wrong. And I think that that's true of so many things in life. There's a philosopher, Isaiah Berlin, who I really love, who has this concept of pluralism. And he says that humans are fundamentally unreconcilable in their aims. We have different goals in life. We have different ways of seeing the world. Different things matter to us. And the hallmark of a good society is to allow people that have competing, or even totally antithetical views to live in peace together. Right? That's pluralism, and that's a success. It's not bringing everyone to think the same thing. Rather, it's acknowledging the essential conflict, and that's what makes life meaningful. And so I think that we have to understand this dispersion of beliefs is going to be a natural part of being human and a good thing. And we don't want to collapse those. We want to embrace it. And I think starting to understand and see the world in that way, to say, gee, my opinion, I think that, X is going to happen in the Middle East. It's like, well, that's one alternative potential history. But distance yourself from feeling too strongly about that, because the probability that you're wrong and some other alternative future happens is pretty darn high.
Right. And what about humans? Are they easier to predict than events, than market events? Let's take, for example, Trump, right? Like pretty simplistic human being, but according to many, very volatile, very chaotic, right? So are these easier to predict? And how do markets react to that? For example, the tariffs and the unpredictability, right? Like the reaction of the market has been quite adverse.
Yeah, this is you're going down a route I'm very interested in, Charles. I think it was Gretzky who said, play the man, not the puck, because people are more predictable than events in some ways, or people's responses to things are more predictable. And this is the whole field of behavioral finance, which is trying to mine these. What are the essential ways that humans interact with markets? Of course, markets are made up of people. What do we see happening, and how is that rooted in human nature? And so we see things like humans feel pain from losses more than they feel pleasure from gains, or we see that people are very confident in making predictions. And that one of the interesting things about the way that people make predictions, interestingly enough, is that the circuitry involved in your brain for making memories is actually the same as the one for making forecasts. So you can think about sort of the hunter-gatherer, right? You're going and you're looking to try to find where the corn grows, and you find it, and then you bring it back, and then the next time you're going out to look for corn, you remember where the corn was, and you make a prediction that it's going to be there again, and you go and look for it. And when markets, people have that same neural circuitry, right? So they say, well, I made money in Bitcoin, so I'm going to go invest more money in Bitcoin because I'll make more money in the future. My forecast is an expression actually of my memory. But the future rhymes, but it doesn't repeat. And so there's a problem in sort of applying these sort of Stone Age brains and tools to an information age where perhaps some of those fundamental assumptions have changed. And so I think that's as an investor, I think a lot of the things that I'm looking for, the things that I think are persistent in markets, are the things that are rooted in human nature, rooted in human error. And I think the humans' desire and hubris about their ability to predict the future is perhaps one of the greatest things that will always be arbitrageable, because people will always think they can predict the future. They'll always make bets on it. And I think they'll always be surprised by their inability to do so.
Have we taken capitalism near its limit nowadays? Do you think that one day this market as we know it will break or will sort of modify itself? And if so, how different would it be from what we have today?
I think capitalism is one of God's greatest gifts to mankind. I mean, I think the amount of people that have been lifted out of poverty by capitalism is unbelievable. And I think going back to Isaiah Berlin's idea of pluralism, right? We want markets because markets allow people to make choices, and to value things differently, and to transact when they need to. And the more that the world can allow for individual choice and accept unreconcilable differences without trying to force people to think the same way or to act the same way, the better off our world will be. And so I think you're always looking for a place where power is more dissociated, more pushed down to the individual, rather than a place where any one individual is too powerful in forcing their own ideas on others. And I think that that's why I think that capitalism or the free markets are the best answer to this, because you avoid the process of somebody else telling you what you should believe or what you should want or what you should do. When in reality, we're all we want so much to be individuals and to dance to the beat of our own drum.
Right. What about predictions in space time? Because I am 99% confident that AI agents will one be a thing and second replace a bunch of people. It's just I'm not certain on the timeline, and I'm notorious for being right, but like before my actual time, so I would be a pretty bad investor, one could say. So how do you deal with that? For example, Bitcoin, right, is another one. I do think AGI is going to crack cryptography one day. It's just a matter of time. Hence, the value of Bitcoin would go to zero. I'm just not sure when.
Hmm.
So, how do you deal with the time aspect?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think that uh, makes what makes investing so difficult, right? Is that you have to be right. People say the markets can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent, is one of the classic lines of Wall Street. So you got to be right, and you got to be right within a time frame that matters. So both the timing and the rightness matter. So I think when it comes to making these sort of long-term predictions, um, you almost have to separate, is this an opinion or an article of faith? It's something that I believe or hope comes true. Or am I making a prediction, right? And if I'm making a prediction, predictions should be time bound. They should be probabilistic. They should be measurable. And I think most people actually are not that interested in making those type of predictions, which are the type of predictions that are necessary for markets. Because if you start making them, first of all, you're going to realize how wrong you are so often. But I think the other thing that's sort of interesting, in human history, often the rational things take longer to come to fruition than you'd expect. That humans are slower to change, the world is slower to adopt new things, even when they're very rational. And you can find all sorts of examples from this and sort of the waves of new technology, right? Like look at people that use the old technology that's clearly obsolete and inferior. You'll still find massive numbers of people using the old obsolete technology for no reason other than stasis.
And regarding that and balancing your brain to be better at making prediction in an age of attention robbery, right? Like where all these social media are playing with your serotonin systems, and there's porn, there's fast food, and all that. How should one's balance their brain to actually be more objective and, should I say, less emotional?
Yeah, this is the sort of classic Daniel Kahneman System One and System Two thinking, right? System One thinking is easy and pleasurable, and System Two thinking is hard and deliberative. And to make good decisions, either we want to train our System One thinking, right? Like you can practice something until your System One thinking is just really good, or you can force yourself to engage in that deeper, logical System Two thinking. And so I think it's a mix. And I think probably the best advice there is the simplest, which is we know what's causing the distraction, which is phones and the internet, and we know there are easy antidotes. Go for a run without your phone, or just sit down with a book. But those things require effort, and I think it's finding a way to disconnect. And I think you read about the effect that AI has on people's brains. In terms of how much people can offload of their brain onto AI. And it's sort of frightening. You think about kids who are growing up there, what their educational system is going to look like when so much of their work can be done easily by AI. They could take a photo of a worksheet and AI can give them the answer in a second. How are you going to force them to do the worksheet? And I think it's interesting. It's a little scary as a parent to think about this. And I certainly, I don't know. I'm not. I generally think humans have made progress over time, but the one area I worry that we've backtracked is in educating our children, where it feels like education 30 years ago is a lot better than it is today.
It's quite interesting because Yeah, I think AI can be a huge force of good for kids if they just brainstorm with it and go down very deep rabbit holes and are constantly curious. They need to be taught that, right? But yeah, I use ChatGPT all the time to as my brain sparring partner. I even don't read books nowadays. I just chat with ChatGPT, do deep research. It's very scientific and it's better than pretty much anything out there. But in other areas, I've also stopped thinking. I've outsourced the copywriting to AIs, right? I don't even think anymore about these kind of things. So yeah, it's an interesting thing. I even launched a school that teaches kid AI, so I'm quite bullish on it. Do you use AI for your research or for brain sparring on your side?
I mean, I've used it all the time. I mean, I don't see how you could not. If you're a thinking person who's curious about the world, the speed at which you can get answers to things and the precision with which you can get answers to things is remarkable. I probably, I don't use it to write my copy or anything yet, but who knows? Maybe in a year or two, it can think for me and write for me as well.
And what's your learning regimen nowadays? Do you still read books? Do you go out for a coffee with buddies to talk with them, or is it mostly with your team? Like, how do you grow this brain of yours nowadays?
Yeah, I think we are a research-driven firm. I mean, I run a think tank that happens to invest money, so I'd say we're constantly coming up with the new ideas and then testing them. And for me, I'm an empiricist. I like to see. I like to come up with an idea and test it. And I have many ideas, all of which I think are good, and a very small percentage of which actually turn out to be good. So I think I can be sort of maddening to the people that work with me because the velocity of the new ideas that's coming and the percentage hit rate on how few of them are actually very good is probably frustrating. But I think a progress requires you need speciation and then you need selection. So for me, and I think the other thing is this is James Joyce wrote about this a lot, but is creativity the creation of something new, or is it just the synthesis of a diverse set of inputs in a new way? And for me, I don't think I'm creative in any way. I don't come up with any new ideas. Everything I come up with is just a synthesis of things that I'm reading that I'm putting together in a novel way, hopefully. And so I think that for me, it's reading as much as possible. I read a lot of academic papers. I read a lot of practitioner work, and I try to integrate that into then coming up with things for my team to test and see if they work.
It's a deep philosophical question, isn't it? Because I think already everything already exists, right? So I agree with you that it's pairing things, and for that same reason, I do think we can predict everything in the future, but like Einstein was thinking back then. So why do you think that way? And isn't life a creation, for example?
Yeah, I like that. I think life is a creation.
But isn't it like the combination of various things that already existed and that just worked well together? Who knows?
Yeah, I mean it's just a redefinition of creativity.
Right. Your fund, like, what's your track record right now? Why do investors come to you via the other fund next door?
I think that uh, generally our clients like to work with us because of our research and how deep and intensive our research is on the ideas that we pursue. And I think people that read our research and understand our worldview and agree with it tend to like working with us. And I think part of what I like about the internet is that it creates a wonderful sort of matching algorithm. If you're yourself on the internet, you sort of find the people that are like-minded, and I think that's ideally the way a great way I found to grow my business or to build client relationships. It's putting yourself out there in a genuine way and saying what it is that you believe, and then finding those 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 1 million people that happen to like that approach. And I think that I think previous to the internet, the way people marketed products or something is they'd create the most generic thing that sort of had some kind of vague common appeal to a massive number of people and hope that that sort of drove people to engage with them. And I think the internet is so much more about specific niches, right? Show that you're authentic, that you have an expertise in some weird area, and then the people will find you who care about that or want to learn about it.
And how do you do a deeper research than the guy next door? Do you leverage AI tools? Do you scrape data in obscure places where others won't go? Like, tell me a bit more about the research process.
Yeah, I don't know that we have any technological advantage relative to anyone else. I think we're just smart, earnest, reasonable people that apply common sense, and a pretty high empirical bar for what we consider to be true.
Tell me about your view on wealth. You know, like at what stage of your life did you know that you were independent financially, and what is your view of money? For example, Warren has never been about like spending it, right? Like a multi-billionaire that still buys Diet Cokes and McDonald's burritos. What is your view on wealth? How to generate it first, and how to spend it, and playing the game, sort of.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I probably think a lot more about saving money than spending money, and I think for me, I think about fundamentally about my children, and for me, that's what's motivating is saving money for them, and wanting them to live a better life, and maybe you can't buy a better life, and so maybe that mission is wrong, but for me, that's what motivates me is that I want my to do everything I do for my children and for my family, and that they can have the opportunities that I had and hopefully better ones, and that I can hopefully be a good father to them. And so for me, I think some level of wealth is having the time to spend with my kids and my family, and what motivates me in my work is thinking about them. And investing on their behalf in every way one could think of.
Most of wealthy folks out there, their kids do not have the same killer instincts that they have, right? Like, how do you make sure to leave your kids with, yeah, like cash, one, like security cushion, but also like the instinct to be independent, because most of the time being taken care of doesn't necessarily lead to happiness.
I probably have a different worldview. I think those people that think that way are actually wrong, empirically. There's a great research out of Princeton. There's a book called "The Sun Also Rises," but it's SON. The Sun Also Rises, and it's actually a study of wealth in Italy over 1,000 years. And it finds actually that the same families have generally been wealthy for the past 1,000 years. That there's actually not a huge amount of social mobility. And they did another wonderful, fascinating case study where they looked at the South after the Civil War, and they looked at it for the reason that the parents all went bankrupt. So right, so like you look at everyone wealthy in the South in 1865 goes bankrupt. But then by 1900, it turns out that their kids are all wealthy again, that there's actually been no social mobility or virtually none. And I think that that's actually the intergenerational transmission of traits and abilities that is driving, a persistence. And so I think on the one hand, you hear of shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations, and of course there's a reversion to the mean. But there's also a remarkable stability in many places in terms of who remains successful. I mean, this is why monarchies, think of monarchies. And I think so. I think empirically, I'd argue actually that the sun also rises is more accurate worldview about the way intergenerational social mobility works.
Right. And is that because the money is already invested on autopilot, or is that because you're saying that
Well,
the kids also make good decisions?
that's why the study of the Confederacy is so interesting, right? The kids didn't grow up with any money. They were all bankrupt. They made it all back in one generation, and so I think it's ideally you're transmitting your work ethic and your intelligence and your values. And I think one thing that you can, I think, transmit to your kids, right, to some extent, is your value system, right? You probably can't. They're going to have their own personalities. They're going to have their own ability level, but the values are things that you can transmit to some extent, I think, and I think there is a set of values that lead to success, and we sort of know what they are: honesty, hard work, persistence, etc. So I think I'd hope that I could inculcate those values as well.
You covered the intellectual part about you learn, right? But any habits that you have on a daily basis to keep you more productive, smarter, happier? For example, meditation, sports. Tell us a bit more about the day in your life.
Yeah, I mean, I think other than work and taking care of kids, the only thing I do on a semi-weekly basis is go to church and pray. And I think that I think that my relationship with God or my faith is one of the most important things that guides me. And I hope that to some extent I can live up to that. But for me, sacred music or prayer or at church, those things are things that ground me and help me be a better person and connect me with things that are more important than me.
Can God and science go hand in hand, especially when it comes to market and your prediction?
Yes, I think the gospel says that we see through we see through a lens only darkly, right? We see through a looking glass darkly. We can't see the future, but God knows the future, and so I think it's acknowledging human limitations is actually central to a lot of people of faith, of saying, "Hey, gee, I as a human have a limited set of abilities, and therefore I have to put myself in God's hands. That a large percentage of the things that matter are not in my control." And I think that's often easier for people of faith to understand. And I think in terms of science, I don't see a conflict between science and religion. Look at the places that preserve knowledge, the Dark Ages, they were all monasteries. So I think that the idea that science and religion is in conflict is actually a falsehood.
Tell me a bit more about, like, yeah, the times in which you had to put into the hands of God some of the decisions that you made through life. How many times, for example, did you know that that business could cost your job, your business, your full bank account?
I mean, I think that that's, I mean, I think that's the nature of everyone's life. I mean, think about all of, whether you attribute to randomness or God or whatever you want to attribute it to, the role, the number of things that are actually inside of your control is so limited in life. And the amount of things that actually happen to you sort of by random chance is so high. Who you meet, what, event you went to and you happen to meet this person, or you happen to invest in this thing at the right time or the wrong time, or such a large percentage of life is like that, I think.
And isn't, yeah, my worldview has been that science steps in when religion isn't useful anymore. Does that make sense as a worldview, or?
Perhaps not to me. I mean, I think that if you think that the world was created by God, and or part of getting to know God better is to understand the world in an accurate way, and science is a path to doing that. Um, uh, um, but I think religion is an important reminder that as just strive as you might, you're not going to figure out everything. That a lot of things are not answerable. And I think that science, or an exclusively sort of scientific worldview, can lead one to a level of hubris about one's own ability to comprehend and understand and predict, which is just wrong. Um,
Yeah, I think it's testosterone also. It's like always having control over everything, right? Like that's very much me. That's why, yeah, science doesn't do that well. I think we're all different. Tell me, Dan, what are your top goals for this year? What you want to accomplish?
I'm hoping to keep growing my business, which is always a goal of mine, and to continue to further my research agenda. Those are probably the two big goals for me.
Right. And where can people find out more about you?
At Verdad Cap on X, where you can also sign up for my weekly research email. And if you want to email me, I'm Dan at verdadcap.com.
So that was Dan Rasmussen.